This video is sponsored by Pixels.com. Stick around to see how you can sell your photos as fine art. Guys, it is here. The brand new Tamron 25-200mm. The generation 2 of the 28-200mm. The generation 1, the Tamron 28-200mm, was a groundbreaking super zoom lens that has been my primary lens for everything landscape photography for the past 4.5 years. The generation 1 28-200mm was never a perfect lens, so I'm super excited to see if the generation 2 will fix those issues. So I've only got to use the Tamron 25-200mm like once, because I've only owned it for a few days, and I will be using it more over the next months. So this is more like a first review and a first few thoughts. And I'm sure you will also want to have some comparisons to the first generation, the 28-200, and of course the newly released Sigma 20-200mm. But let's put the Sigma 20-200mm to the side for a moment. And throughout this review, instead of saying 25-200 or 28-200 and 20-200 all the way through, I'm just going to call them the 28, the 25, and the 20mm lenses, or the Tamron, or the Sigma. I'm sure you can figure it out. I'm just skipping the 200mm part. And it's of course important to say that this video is not sponsored by Tamron or Sigma, and these three lenses are my own. So the first and biggest difference between the two Tamron lenses is that the new lens has a USB-C port that you can use for firmware updates, and that you can get access to the Tamron utility tool on your computer. Through the software you can customize the lens a little bit, and customization is also a big part of the new Tamron lens because it has a customizable button on the side, which the old Tamron lens does not have. Both lenses also have a locking button so you don't extend the tubes unnecessary. And the 25mm is slightly bigger and slightly heavier than the old Tamron. It comes in at 573 grams, and holding them like this, yes, it feels slightly heavier, but once you put this on the camera and you have your L bracket on and so forth, it's still a very, very light lens. It does not feel that it's heavier than half a kilo. In all practical sense, I don't think you will be able to feel a difference when you hold them up against each other. Weather sealing wise, the 25mm has also been upgraded since the 28mm and now have 12 points of weather sealing, whatever that means. And it is supposedly also a little bit better than the Sigma, which has 5 points of weather sealing less. The Sigma is already pretty decently weather resistant. And compared to the 28-200, I've never really had any issues with that one. If I've been shooting in very, very damp conditions, very, very wet conditions, and I haven't brushed it off perfectly, then the day after, I could end up with a little bit of fog on the element here in front if I changed the conditions quite a lot, the temperature conditions that I was shooting in quite a lot. But I have, over the past 4.5 years, where I've used and abused the 28-200mm, and it has been my primary lens, not had any issues with the weather. So one thing is to have the right equipment, but what do you do with the photos once you've finished them? How do you actually start selling them? I finally got to set up a proper print shop about a month ago at Pixels.com, so I'm super happy to have them, Pixels.com, sponsor this video. Pixels has been a gold standard for artists and photographers looking to monetize their work since 2006. They are known for high quality, reputable products manufactured globally. This means your products will be manufactured close to your customer, reducing friction and costs. Hundreds of thousands of artists trust them, and so do huge brands like Getty Images, Condé Nast, and Sports Illustrated. Pixels.com is the international brand of Fine Art America, and their main feature for creators is that they provide you with a full, professional, print-on-demand website, not just a shop on a huge marketplace. You can have your own working site up and running in 5 to 10 minutes. It's an all-in-one solution that truly simplifies selling. Getting your new photos online is effortless. When you upload an image, Pixels automatically handles the boring work and generates titles, keywords, and product description to speed up the listing process. And this is of course something you can always edit yourself if you want to. You also get to set up your own profit margins and keep 100% of your markup. Besides traditional prints with different finishes, you can also have your photos printed on everything from mugs over bath towels to jigsaw puzzles. As a photographer, I would probably recommend curating your offers a bit and not offer every single product available. Your site looks completely professional. You can organize your work into collections like I have based on geography or theme, giving your customers an easy way to browse your offers. And the product configuration is great. Customers can switch between product types like a canvas, metal print, or a simple art print, change the size, and see it all rendered in real time. This reduces friction and drives sales. Not to mention, they also advertise through Google, so that if you have a photo that people actually search for, they may find it through Google Images. Pixels handles all the production, shipping and customer service, and they use great manufacturers. Just look at the samples I received. The prints are fantastic, showing off the quality of the image you captured with a lens like the Tamron. I'm personally really happy with how my print store turned out, so if you're ready to start selling your photos, Pixels.com is the platform I've chosen. Click the link in the description below and set up your own print-on-demand website today. And let's get back to talking about the Tamron 25-200mm Super Zoom lens. Price-wise, it is $699 for the old Tamron, $899 for the new Tamron, and $999 for the Sigma. But of course, the Sigma also gives you a slightly larger focal range. And just to spell it out, you can right here see the difference between 20mm and 25mm. So the widest of the 20-200mm versus the widest of the 25-200mm. It is quite a significant difference in 5mm in the wide end. So let's talk about stability, because stability is one of the most important parts of getting a sharp photo with any lens. And that is also the downside to these three lenses. They are not super stable. First and foremost, none of the lenses come with inbuilt stabilization, so they do depend on the in-camera stabilization. For newer cameras like my A7R5 that I'm filming on right now, that's not a big deal, and I've easily been able to get handheld photos between half a second to 1 second, but it does depend on the focal length that I'm using. It is easier to get a stable photo with wider focal lengths than with narrower focal lengths. The big downside to these lenses is that they extend like this, and that means that whenever you put them on a camera, the front part here is very far from the center of gravity in your setup. And that means that just the slightest amount of wind will probably end up shaking your camera. This can of course be compensated for with a sturdy tripod, but even with the most sturdy tripod, a tiny bit of wind will shake your camera. And when it comes down to high megapixel cameras like 40 or 60 megapixels, you will see a tiny bit of blur. And if you add a filter or a lens hood to your setup, it only becomes worse. If you're doing long exposures with filters on, with longer focal lengths, then I would probably look into getting a lens with a lens hood on, like a 70-200mm. These lenses are primarily designed as travel and all-round lenses. They are not dedicated landscape lenses. So even though you travel to do landscape photography, that does not count as travel photography. It is designed for usually handheld photography in environments where you do not have to think too much about the wind influencing your photography. The Tamron 25-200mm also have like half macro capabilities, so it is good for getting close-up photos. However, according to other reviewers, the Sigma 20-200mm is slightly better for that. So if macro is very important for you, maybe the Sigma 20-200mm is the better choice for that. The 25-200mm now also have a better focusing motor. Now, I've personally never had any issues with the 28mm regarding focus, but I am also a landscape photographer. I have though used the 28mm for wildlife photography and photographing birds in flight, and I've never really had any issues with that. So I guess the 25mm is just even better. And as a side note to the wildlife and sports photographers, The Tamron 25 to 200mm is also limited to 15 frames a second because it's a Tamron lens and not a Sony lens, and Sony do limit third-party lenses a little bit in the FPS that they can get out of it, frames per second. The just out of focus areas from all these three lenses aren't particularly creamy and smooth and bokeh-licious, and that's just a feature of these lenses and how they're designed. However, as a landscape photographer, if you can't get the entire photo in focus from front to back, then you would probably want to focus stack the photo at an optimal aperture to get it as sharp as possible. Now, despite them being variable aperture lenses and they close down, they are relatively dark lenses, you can still get plenty of background blur whenever you do portraits and you zoom in beyond like 150mm. So if you are into portraits with a lot of background blur, these can't be used, but you probably would not choose any of these lenses for specifically that. They are all general purpose lenses. They are not master of anything, besides being the master of being super practical. And if you want to learn how to focus stack, improve the sharpness of your photos in post-processing, cleaning your photos properly, blend and edit with luminosity masks to optimize and reduce the impact of noise in your photos, and much, much more, then my big post-processing course, Photoshop for Landscape Photographers, is for you. Here I share all my editing techniques for making amazing landscape photos, teaching you what mistakes to avoid and how to respect the light when you edit your photos. There's a coupon code for my YouTube viewers with a $45 discount along with a link for signing up for the course down in the description of the video. And that's another thing to be aware of, that the light gathering potential of these three lenses aren't particularly great. That simply just means that with the variable aperture, whenever you zoom in, the aperture closes down, and closing down the aperture, you will have to compensate with a bigger ISO, so you introduce more noise. So even though both the 28 and 25mm start at f2.8, as soon as you start zooming in, that actually drops to f3.2 and then f3.5 relatively fast. The 28mm stops down to its most closed down aperture, f5.6, at around 150mm, whereas the 25mm does the same thing already just below 100mm. But that's nothing compared to the Sigma lens that stops down to f5.6 already around 50mm, and then further stops down to its closest aperture, f6.3, at 85mm. Now, for us landscape photographers, that doesn't matter whatsoever because we are always shooting a little bit stop down anyway to get sharper photos. But if you use these lenses as all-round lenses and you want to have as clean as possible photo, then generally it's something to be aware of. That said, again, if this means a lot to you, you would probably not buy these lenses for that purpose anyway. And chances are, if you're still watching this video on my channel, you're probably more interested in the landscape features of these lenses anyway. But let's finally just jump into some image quality comparisons. I just think it's so important for me to emphasize that image quality isn't everything when it comes to lenses, and I have been very happy about the 28 to 200 for the past years. You can see I have easily been able to take forest photos with that lens that come out tack sharp. You can see here, these are the photos I've taken with the 28 to 200mm in Denmark over the past almost 5 years, some of my most iconic photos. And even though they are forest photos, either just focus stack them or zoom a bit in and you will avoid the worst corners in the wide end. And a good example is also a photo like this. You can see the corners. There's not really any detail in the corners that needs to be sharp. And if you do have some details here in the lower corners, I would simply just focus stack the photo to get it as sharp as possible. And that is just so important for me to emphasize that the most important part of any camera system, whether the camera or the lens, are the 20 centimeters behind the camera. How you use the camera and the lens are so much more important than whether or not it is super duper uber tack sharp or not. So how you compose the photos, how you use the light, what's your storytelling and so forth is what makes a good photo. As Ansel Adams said, There's nothing worse than a sharp photo of a fuzzy concept, or something to that degree. So if you want to learn about composition, how to think composition, or how to use the light and color in landscape photography, be sure to get my ebooks on exactly those topics, with minimal text and tons of examples and extended EXIF data for all the photos. They're super easy to read, and you can see exactly how I got each photo. You can get the free light versions of the ebooks by subscribing to my newsletter, and for the full versions you can get them either standalone or bundled up for a small discount. There's a link to them down in the description of the video. And just before we get started, I'm going to show you real-world examples. The reason why I do that is that there are so many other reviewers showing charts and controlled indoor examples. But I'm personally more interested in how these lenses will perform when you are actually out in nature. And I am going to use a real-world example from a forest where I can push these lenses to the limit. So let's just start out with vignetting. So here is the 25 to 200 millimeter at 25 millimeter. And let's just start wide open at 2.8. And you can see there's quite severe vignetting. The corners, the sides of the photo is quite dark. But as we stop down, you can see how the side of the photos get brighter and brighter. And all the way down to like f4, 5, f5-ish. And it just stays the same all the way down to f16. Now you can compensate for the vignetting by simply just enabling the profile corrections. And you can see it makes quite a big difference. So I've specifically chosen this scene because it's a calm morning. There's no wind in the trees. I'm interested to see how it performs in a forest environment because I do a lot of forest photography. And for landscape photography, it's also the most demanding scene for most lenses, especially in high contrast parts, as in the top of the trees, where you usually get a lot of fringing and chromatic aberration between the branches and the background sky. In most other scenes in landscape photography, as I've already demonstrated, the optical performance of these lenses are probably negligible compared to other and sharper lenses. And all these photos have been photographed on my Sony a7R5, so a 60 megapixel camera. So what I'm the most interested in is how this lens perform in the wide end, and also compared to, of course, the Sigma 20mm and the old Tamron 28mm. But let's just start at looking wide open at 25mm with the 25 to 200mm. And I've taken a range of test shots right here. I am not clicking on remove chromatic aberration, and I'm not doing any kind of defringing. However, I have put on use profile corrections. So let's start out by just zooming in to 400mm. The foreground here is a little bit out of focus, but as you can see in the background at even f2.8, it is pretty decently sharp. If we go to the corners, you can see that we are suffering from some fringing right here. But overall, the details, the sharpness is actually pretty acceptable. If we stop down to f4, you can see it only gets a little bit better. And f5 also slightly better. And f8 also pretty good, but I do think that f5.6 is maybe the sharpest part of this lens. If we go down to f11, we can start seeing some diffraction creeping in, and that is definitely also present here at f16. You can see the details are just much softer, although in focus much softer. And if we go back to f11, you can also see that instantly we get much sharper details. And further back to f8, a slight improvement, and f5, yeah, it's more or less the same between f5.6 and f8. And just to show you the middle here also, f2.8, nice and sharp, a little bit sharper at f4, more or less the same, maybe a tiny bit sharper at f5.6, and at f8 we actually start seeing some diffraction creeping in, and likewise at f11 even more diffraction, and f16. That said, at f8 we still have really good details right here. Alright, so even though it's not an apples to apples comparison, I still want to see how the three lenses are performing at their widest. And let's just start at f5.6, go to 400, and you can actually see at f5.6, the Sigma is tack sharp. Comparing that to 25mm at the 25 to 200mm, also tack sharp. And the 28mm, also tack sharp right in the middle. However, the background is slightly out of focus. And this is the same story at f8 and f11. And likewise, when we jump between the apertures at the 25mm, f5.6 and f8 tack sharp, and a tiny bit of diffraction at f11. And with the Sigma, tack sharp f5.6, tack sharp at f8, and a little bit of diffraction creeping in at f11. If we go to the extreme corners, you can see there's a lot of fringing going on at 5.6 on the Sigma. But when we look at the Tamron 25mm, there's also a lot of fringing going on. And it's even worse on the 28mm. So a lot of fringing on all three of these lenses. Although I would argue that maybe the Sigma is handling it slightly better. If we stop down, we get more details in the Sigma. We get more details in the Tamron 25mm. And we also get more details in the 28mm. But in the extreme wide end, all three lenses aren't too good, as you can see. Comparing all three lenses when it comes to sharpness, if we just put the exposure down a tiny bit, that just make more details pop out. It's really hard to see which one is the better lens. It's really, really hard. So the sharpness sweet spot is around f8 for all three lenses. Sometimes f5.6 is a tiny bit sharper, and sometimes you can benefit a little bit from stopping down to f11, but it is negligible. So let's just compare the f8 results on all the lenses throughout different focal lengths. So let's start here at about 28mm for all three lenses. And let's go into 400mm here in the middle. The Sigma, tack sharp background. The Tamron 25mm, tack sharp background. And the 28mm I managed to focus here on the foreground branch. The background is slightly out of focus, but at least the branch you can see is tack sharp. If we go to the corners, you can see the Sigma is, I guess, acceptable. It is very important for me to emphasize that this here is the extreme corner. You can see how much we are zoomed in. If I jump back and forward like this, if we go to the Tamron 25mm, it's maybe, I'm not even sure it's better than the Sigma. And we have a lot of fringing going on still here at the 28mm, which almost looks a hair sharper than the two others, but that can be a focusing thing. No, it's maybe a bit softer, but isn't it as if the details are more defined? There's definitely less fringing, much less fringing in the 25mm than in the 28mm. So that's very nice to see that they have worked on fixing that. And in the Sigma, there's actually hardly any fringing, but the Sigma here is also zoomed more in and is closer to the sweet spot range of the focal lengths than both the Tamron lenses are. At around 35mm, zooming in right here in the middle, the Sigma, nice and crisp, nice and sharp. The 25mm, also nice and sharp here in the background. And the 28mm, nice and sharp here in the foreground. Let's go to the corners. Still a substantial amount of fringing going on for the 28mm. For the 25mm, it cleans almost up by now. At 35mm, we have slight purples going on right here. And the Sigma definitely have much, much cleaner edges compared to the two others. And sharpness-wise, it's really hard to say. If I lower the exposure so we can see more details here in the background, it can also be a focus thing. Even when you zoom into like 35mm, you need to be aware of your focus so much when you're photographing in a forest environment. I actually think the Sigma wins this one. You see here, if we look at this area right here, But yeah, it's definitely a focus thing because the foreground branch here is sharper on the Tamron than the background. Whereas on the Sigma, the foreground branch here is slightly softer than on the Tamron, but the background is definitely better on the Sigma. It's a focusing thing. Both those lenses seems to be better, slightly better. Actually not even better than the 28-200. I think the 28-200 is actually sharper than the 25. No, yes, no, yes. Gosh, these real world examples, it just goes to show how completely irrelevant this pixel peeping is. So now we are at 50mm and zoom into 400%. The Sigma, nice and sharp in the background. Tamron, again, I actually think it's maybe more a focusing thing. Yeah, because it's definitely softer, but it's also softer here in the background. Did it focus beyond infinity? And we can definitely see that the 28mm is more in focus here. Yeah, the 28mm is more in focus at 50mm than what I've captured with the 25mm. But the background is definitely sharper on the 25mm. But the Sigma definitely has the most sharp background here. Let's go to the extreme corners and let's just darken down the photos just so we can get more details. The Sigma, fairly sharp, definitely sharper than the 25, but then the 28 is sharper than the 25 again. I must have missed focus a slight bit on the 25 because when we compare the Sigma and the 28, maybe the Sigma is a hair sharper, but not much. So here we are at around 100mm. Let's zoom all the way in. And here focusing really matters when we are zoomed in 200mm in a forest environment. Real world practical examples almost doesn't matter because if you just focus a meter in difference between the shots that you make, it will have a massive influence to the perception of the depth of your photo. So here is the Sigma at 100mm. In the middle, you can see it's nice and sharp. At 25mm, I do not have the background in focus, but I have the foreground in focus. And yeah, well, it's sharp too. And here the 28mm is also focused on the background. But I do think, yeah, the Sigma is definitely sharper than the 28mm. In the corners, the Sigma is a bit meh, I guess. Yeah, the 25 is out of focus. And the 28 is probably the one with the best corners in this example. Yeah, definitely the one with the best corners. But again, it can't be down to focusing. I just wanted to check the other corner. So you can see over here. And I have to go a little bit in because else I don't have any details with the Sigma. But yeah, you can see it's much more in focus here, much better corner. And that's because these branches are located at a different distance from the camera than the branches in the other corner. So when I compare here to the other two lenses, you can even see that some of the branches are more in focus on the 25mm, where we couldn't see any branches in focus on the other. And here they are nice and sharp, like there's no issues with these foreground branches. And on the 28, the background is also nice and sharp. And here they're definitely more alike in sharpness, even though the 28 is probably a tiny bit sharper. And finally, zoomed all the way in at 200mm. If we go to 400% zoom, you can see the Sigma is nice and sharp right here in the background. The 25 also nice and sharp here in the background. I've managed to focus it properly this time. And maybe the 28 is a tiny bit softer. Yeah, the 28 is definitely a tiny bit softer. You can see in this area right here, the 28 is a tiny bit softer. The 25 definitely wins in the long end. But again, focusing matters more. Let's go to the corners. So here in the corners, the 20mm, you can see more fringing is definitely going on right here. If we look at the 25, less fringing, and the 28, also a lot of fringing going on. sharpness wise, the 25 also wins this one, but again, where you focus will matter so much more. So yeah, the Sigma and the Tamron 25 are definitely sharper than the 28. Let's just go to the other corner and see what happens there. Here's the Sigma with plenty of fringing going on. 25, definitely sharper, the 25 right here. And a little bit soft for the 200. And remember, if you want to fix fringing, you can go down here, sample fringing, and just click wherever and put on remove chromatic aberration. And you can probably get rid of most of the fringing. And you can of course always like pull the sliders right here to remove more. You can see I've also almost removed it here on the 25, and on the 20 there's a little bit left. So overall it does seem as if Tamron has fixed most of the issues that were with the 28mm. A bit better corners in the wide end, a little bit sharper in the long end, but besides falling a bit off in the long end, I would say that you can hardly see much of a difference between the 25 to 200 and the Sigma 20 to 200. If you're a Sony shooter and you want even better image quality than what these lenses can provide, then I would suggest to combine something like the 20 to 70mm f4 with the 70 to 200mm f4 2 lens, both from Sony. They are both relatively compact because they are f4, but the downside is of course that you will have to change the lenses more, and they are very much more expensive than any of these three lenses on their own. So which one lens to choose? I can't say. I feel more comfortable shooting at the wide end with the 25 to 200mm than I do with either of the other two. However, in most circumstances, I would probably still use a 16 to 35mm f4 or f2.8 in the wide end. The 25mm seems to be slightly sharper than the 20mm from beyond 35mm. But in the end, like in all practical sense, would you be able to see the difference? You will have to print massively large, like 2 or 3 meters on glossy paper in highest quality, or a metal print in highest quality, and stand with your nose up against the print and just look at the corners. Then yes, then maybe you can see a difference between these two lenses. But I think in all practical purposes, unless you pixel peep, you will probably not be able to see the difference anyway. So yeah, that's my answer. I'm sorry I couldn't give you a better answer for these two lenses. I would say congratulations to both Sigma and to Tamron. You have made some really great super zoom lenses that I think that 99.9% of all photographers out there will be very happy with. If you want to sell your photos as art, be sure to check out pixels.com. If you want to learn much more about landscape photography, check out the links in the description of the video for my ebooks and my course. See you next time.